The Entrepreneur MBA podcast purpose is to help existing business owners grow their companies past the 20 million in revenue per year benchmark. Here is your host, Stephen Halastik.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Halastik, and I am co-founder and managing partner of Financing Solutions. Financing Solutions is a leading provider of lines of credit to small businesses. Our line of credit program is fast, easy, inexpensive, and costs nothing to set up, making it a great cash backup plan for your business. I firmly believe that every business should have a line of credit, just in case. If you would like to learn more about our line of credit program, please visit us at www.fscreditline.com, FS as in Financing Solutions, or fscreditline.com, or give us a call at 862-207-4118. Today, I am excited to be speaking with my good friend, Jeff Agostinelli. I was introduced to Jeff by serial entrepreneur David Mamano, who runs the Avante Group. And when I listened to Jeff's podcast and read more about Jeff personally and his coaching practice, I knew I had someone that could talk about a topic that I think is really overlooked: the importance of being physically and mentally fit for entrepreneurs. Jeff had at one time wanted to be a doctor, so he was pre-med in college. He found out about Western medicine and then took a detour and became a macrobiotic chef, focusing on alternative healing, which resulted in him being a private chef for 6 years. That in turn led Jeff into being dedicated to a future career of what he's been doing for the past 6 years in life and business coaching. It is the beginning of the new year, and I'm sure that many of our listeners have diet goals as part of their New Year's resolution. So I think this is a very timely podcast. So Jeff, I'd like to welcome you to the Entrepreneur MBA podcast.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Stephen.
Sure. So, this is something that, I know a lot of entrepreneurs, hundreds, and, a lot of it's got to do with my association with the Entrepreneur Organization. And, I just really feel like entrepreneurship, it can really break you. And it's also, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I just really feel, and I've always felt that being physically and mentally fit really helps you be just good at what you do for a living. And do you feel that that's important?
I think it's the most important thing. I mean, that's why I do what I do. I think that, for me, I've always wanted to help people. As you said, I was pre-med in biology, and I wanted to do neurosurgery was the focus I wanted to go into. And I was always fascinated with like the brain and just how we're this amazing mechanism, not really a machine, but a mechanism. And I think that it's very underrated how to use it, and very unknown for a lot of people that it's their most important asset.
Yeah, and I just want to share with our listeners just a little bit why I feel it's important, but how I got here. And that is, I played baseball in college, and I had a baseball coach who would say is, when it comes time to practice, or when it comes time to the game time, you have to be at your best. You have to forget about what's going on, with your girlfriends or boyfriends, or you have to forget about all these other things that are going on at school, and you have to stay focused. And on top of that, he would say is the training that you've done in the weight room and the stuff that you put in your body when you eat directly will result in your success on the field. So whenever I go to work, and I think of that as game time, and that I have to be at my best. And so for me, I carried that right along through my entrepreneurship, my entrepreneurship experience. So, Jeff, when you are working with people that you're either coaching, or it could be friends, it could be your podcast that you do, it could be the lectures that you are asked to speak at. What do you tell people?
Wow, that's a big question. So the first place I usually start with
Yeah.
folks is you said it great though, Stephen, is being physically and mentally fit, right? I was actually at a meeting this morning, and this guy was, after I told him what I did, he just started kind of like fire hose unloading on how amazing that he had absolutely no idea and had just lost, I think he said something like 15 acquaintances to suicide. And this is going to the extreme end, but like
Wow.
there are so there's so many people who are silently suffering, right? And there are so many people who don't know how to ask for help and really don't know how to take care of themselves. And Stephen, what I usually tell people first is I do my best to recontextualize the entrepreneurial journey or
Mm.
how to play the game, right?
Mm.
So take baseball, for instance. You've got this, you have the season and you have off season. Tell me the number of entrepreneurs you know who play entrepreneurship that way. None.
No, no way. No.
Absolutely.
It's
What would happen
100%
if you
they're all
played
in
ball
on
that way?
entrepreneurship, and that's it. Yeah. Oh, I would completely burn out, and I'd probably get kicked off the team for performance
And what might
because I
happen
wouldn't be
first
able to
before anything
perform for the
else?
team.
Yeah, you'd get injured,
Well, I'd
right?
probably break down.
And
I would think that
that's
might
what's
not.
really happening is like
Oh
so
yeah, yeah,
many
yeah. Correct,
entrepreneurs
correct.
are really overtraining, right? My greatest teacher, I say, for this journey of business is I'm an ultra runner, so I run anything higher than a marathon, so 26 miles plus. I ran a 50K ultra trail race this past year in November. And that was really my greatest teacher
Yep.
because to train for an ultra, you can't just run. You have to stretch. You have to do mobility. You have to pace yourself. You have to understand how to schedule. You have to do so many things. So, the first thing I try to help people understand is it's not necessarily what they're doing that is bad or negative or that's getting them into trouble. It's how they're thinking about what they're doing, right? So I think mindset has been completely just beaten and bastardized, right? That terminology. And I like it, but it's so much more than just what we think. It's how we think, it's how we feel, and it's really understanding how to interpret what is going on in our life, in our body, in our business, and really in our emotions too, to understand how to move forward strategically. And this is at the core of, for instance, working smarter instead of harder. This is at the core of making the right connections at the right time. All that stuff doesn't happen by just hustling your ass off, right? So it doesn't happen by just working 24/7. It happens by understanding that there are cycles. If you look at nature, right? The moon waxes and wanes. There are seasons, right? If you look at sports, the world's top athletes, they are not just training on the court, on the field 100% of the time. Their recovery strategy is second to none. So that's really how I start to kind of rewire the circuits.
Yeah. So let's talk about typical entrepreneurs. And I belong to a group of entrepreneurs. We've been
Hmm.
together for 20 years, and we talk all the time. We've all been through ups and
Hmm.
downs, and I think what happens in the first couple of years of your business, you're putting in 80, 90, 100 hours, and everything is about the business.
Yeah.
And then I think, Jeff, you hit the nail right on the head. And then you either start to burn out or things start to break down mentally, physically, all that stuff. And then you kind of have a moment where you're like, I, I don't think I could do this anymore. And then you kind of rearrange your life and you get back into maybe some physical activity, or you start concentrating on your sleep,
Hmm.
and or
Yeah.
you unfortunately there's sometimes life events that are thrown at you. You either get married or you get divorced. um, and then like you kind of have this moment where you're like, I got to do something about this. um, and you know, the thing that the variable that I see that's often in that is when you start changing different ages. So your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, when you start changing those,
Hmm.
that's another variable. Like when you're 40 years old or 50, let's say 50 years old, sleep becomes more and more important. Um, so when you're working with clients, and what do you see as often their number one biggest issue when it comes to health and mental, physical and mental health?
Everyone's got their poison, right? And I think we all pick it uniquely, right? So, for instance, there's two ways I like to address this. One is to find the keystone habit that people have that can keep everything else in place. But also, I find their kryptonite, right? Like that thing that weakens them. Because I also think that the thing that is our greatest weakness, for instance, is also our greatest strength. Not that it's a deficiency, but it's something that we're doing inverted, and that when we can turn that thing around, it becomes like our superpower, right? So, yeah.
Give me an
So when it
example.
comes to the ability to get a ton of stuff done, right? If you can harness that, right, like the ability to hustle 24/7 is a very good quality if you place it correctly, right? So I had there's an ultra marathoner. His name is Charlie Engel, right? And he said it this way. He said he's a world renowned. He ran across the Sahara Desert. He was in a movie called Running the Sahara. It was narrated by Matt Damon. It was, like a full on movie, like a real movie, a documentary, right? And he went from like complete drug addict in the gutter, like I can't remember the name of his book right at this moment, but he tells a story of just this completely degenerate past. And he'll admit himself, he was an addict. He got sober, and then he started running ultras, and then he started just getting so involved in the running community. And now that's what he does. And he goes around the world. He's doing a expedition right now called the 5.8, and it's running from the lowest point to the highest point, right, on 7 continents. So it's like 2,600 miles in some places, like in Africa, from the lowest point to the summit of Kilimanjaro, which he just did. And
Yep.
he said it this way. He says, the addict is all the best parts of me. So the same person that wound him up in the gutter doing all kinds of drugs is the same part of him that allows him to have that stick-to-itiveness and tenacity to really go and do these crazy expeditions and completely commit himself to the task at hand, right? So they have similar qualities, but on the drug addict side, they're inverted. And on the ultra athlete, what some people would consider crazy, that depth of intensity is just turned in a different direction. Does that make sense?
So,
I'm saying it
so are you
is.
saying that your greatest strength can also be your greatest weakness?
Yeah. So the addict who gets into the wrong thing takes it in the wrong direction.
All right, so let's
Mm-hmm.
take like entrepreneurs who are known to work a lot of hours. That's
Right.
They might see their work ethic as a great strength, but it's also their great weakness because.
Because if they have just one gear, right? If they just work,
Yep.
let's say 16-hour days, 5 days a week, they're working 90 hours a week. That is not a useful strategy for a long-term pursuit. But if they then take that commitment and say, okay, I'm going to apply this amount of discipline and have a variable schedule and really schedule themselves out so they're getting the right activities done, they're delegating, they're hiring the right people. And then, for instance, say the husband who is going to take that same skill, right, and like plan an amazing romantic holiday for him and his wife, right, and like surprise the shit out of her and really like nurture his relationship and take that same skill into his marriage instead of quote unquote using it all up in his business. So it's just misplaced in a way.
Yeah, I know what my baseball coach would say in that situation, and it's again things I apply still today, and that is he'd say practice should in baseball should never be more than 2 hours. Because
Mm-hmm.
if your practice is 4 hours, he goes, you're just wasting 2 hours because you should be able to get that in a 2 hour practice.
Right.
So it's almost the same thing with someone who's working a 16-hour day. It's like, should some of this be delegated, the work that you're doing? Can you be more productive?
Mm-hmm.
Are you, and I think what people like, I look at this sometimes like, you only have a certain amount of gas in your gas tank.
For sure.
And if you use it all up, there's no reserves.
No.
So, just pace yourself.
Mm-hmm. I think what's important too,
So,
Stephen, is that there's a cycle with it, which I might get into later, but go ahead. You were going to ask something?
No, no, no. So I get what you're saying. I mean, listen, a lot of my friends who own their own businesses, right? They're not running ultra marathons,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not even running, at all. So maybe we should bring it down to some of the most basic level things that people should be doing to make sure that they're, doing a good job of being an entrepreneur. What would some of those things be, you think, at the most basic level?
Well, that's really tough to say because I don't think that anybody really should be doing anything. I think that if their
Hmm.
lifestyle and their beliefs are getting them to their goals, then that's all that really matters. If they're moving in the direction of their goals and their relationships suck and they're getting sick and their kids hate them, clearly that's not an effective strategy if they want to have a good relationship with their kids and if they want to have great health. So the first thing is for people to be very clear on what the heck they want and not to have it
Right.
just be about their business. And I think I'm just reflecting on this conversation I had with this guy this morning. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact of so many entrepreneurs identify with their business to the point where it's like it is them. So when they're not in their business, they
Hmm.
feel insufficient or they feel lost or they don't feel as effective or as strong. And it almost becomes like this addiction, right? So when that thing's not working or when they're having challenges in it, it's a personal offense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So have other interests.
Yeah, have other interests, but it's like the first things first is like get ultra clear on what it is that you want, right? So for some people that may be right. Like I have a 9-year-old daughter. I run my business. I love to run. I love to train. I like to do other things. So for me, it's very important to do what I need to do in a particular time frame, and I can only use this excuse in this department as like I don't have time to waste playing around on social media. I don't have time to waste, putzing around doing stuff unless that time is scheduled for, I have actual time where I just go and just meander, right? It's leisure time. I mean, if you look in history, the people who had leisure time were some of the greatest thinkers on the planet. And that was scheduled leisure time to allow that part of the creative cycle. And I don't mean creative like creating art, but I mean the rest instead of the action, because you can't always be in action because you have to give space for those ideas, those concepts, those next actions to really flood in.
So your experience as a chef, I
Hmm.
it, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed that you were really using food to help people feel better. It's so to speak. That's not the right way to put it. Well, tell us a little bit about your experience as a chef.
Yeah, so the form of cooking is called macrobiotics, and it was originally brought to the U.S. by a guy named George Osawa and Michio Kushi. And I guess you could say, intent of it was to help people recover from conditions like diabetes or cancer or different things that were seen in that system as an imbalance in the body, right? Loosely based on traditional Chinese medicine, and the concepts of, let's say, yin and yang, right? So like expansive and contractive. And the theory behind it was that you could balance the energies of the body based on the meridian systems and different things to restore balance in the body so that the body system naturally came back into balance, and that so-called condition, whatever that imbalance in the body was, corrected itself. So basically what I did was these people were either post, let's say, chemo and radiation. I typically worked with people who had stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. So I would live in their homes and prepare meals for them anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. And this diet was essentially prescribed by a macrobiotic counselor. So I would go in and cook that prescribed diet for them for whatever determined period of time.
And did you ever apply that same type of, I don't want to say methodology, but to anybody that you were potentially coaching who was a business owner?
Ooh, I'm not sure I fully understand your question. Same methodology, meaning,
The idea of really eating well to improve their energy level, to help them be
oh,
clear as.
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, garbage in, garbage out, right? So it's like if you're
Yeah.
eating processed, I mean, at the base of it, if you look at how our body works, and we function on a microscopic level. So if you're eating, things with additives, that's processed, that's not real food. It's not real food. It's so, for the person who eats like a standard American diet, it's a hard pill to swallow, I guess, pun intended there. But if you look at it, if you eat closer to nature, you operate more in a natural rhythm. I mean, it just makes sense. So let's say you're eating things that grow from the ground, right? There's more of a harmony. There's more of a harmonious thing. We're an animal, right? Yeah, we're domesticated, but if we're eating more in line with what naturally grows, that is more of a natural human being diet. I don't care if it's vegan, I don't care if it's paleo, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what the type of eating style is, but like eating as close to nature as possible, not eating things out of packages and like crazy processed stuff. If you don't know what the ingredients say, you shouldn't put that stuff in your body, right?
So why don't we do it?
Because it's very difficult for most people to, I mean, think about the average person who grew up eating everything out of a box, who knows no different, who eats fast food. That's kind of like, I don't know, going to some very remote area and showing an indigenous person an iPhone. They're going to be like, oh, they're going to be completely blown away, right? It's a completely different thing. But when you look at somebody who has no idea, first of all, most people think if I don't eat X amount of protein, I'm going to wither and die, right? If you look at like the typical athlete that knows nothing, they're like, I have to eat 2 times my body weight in protein. That's so false. There's so many, it's like, I don't want to make it all about diet, but like there are so many myths in the diet space that are just so blatantly wrong, and there's so much science to back it up that it's not even worth, I don't want to sound like too like, I don't know, bullheaded about it, but it's almost like not even worth addressing a lot of it because there's so much science that it's just like if someone does the work, they can't deny it, right? A good friend of mine wrote a book called Proteinaholic, Dr. Garth Davis, and he's a vegan bariatric surgeon. And he's also an Ironman athlete. I'm also vegan. I'm an ultra athlete. And it's like when people would look at like what he eats or what I eat and how we train and how we recover really quickly and how we can do these crazy things, it just supports it. It's just natural. It's just what we're bred to do.
Yeah, I had a guy speaking on. It was a friend of mine, David Hauser, and he built this company called Grasshopper, $110 million company, and then he sold it. And he was not an athlete, and he later on took up doing marathons because he wanted to get healthy and get his weight down. And after 5 years of doing it, he just said that this isn't working for me. And then he wrote a book called that just came out called oh God, it just came out. I'll think of it in a second. He wrote a book about his experiences over the next 10 years of really getting healthy. And he's got like he is a self not prescribed. I can't think of the right word. He said about himself that he has ADHD and he's like really intense. So he like dove into every aspect of his life when it came to health because he was so frustrated that he really couldn't get the weight off that he wanted to get comfortable. And so he wrote about that experience. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me is that what he does is he experiments with various different changes. And instead of reading, like he'll read about the scientific evidence behind it, but he'll try it for like 3 months. And then he'll say, do I feel better? Do I feel worse? And what I learned from that book was the idea that make these changes and then try to and basically say, do I feel better? So going back to the idea that you're saying about a certain amount of protein, well, if you eat less protein than what's prescribed, do you feel better after a period of time? And that's what his, I really got a lot out of that. He was on the Pat podcast about that as well. And, because
Mm.
it's just hard. Everyone's telling you different things, the keto diet or which, is like the new fad. I don't know if it's true or not. Um, but what do you think about all these diets that come out?
I think it's insane, number one. I think that we're out of all species on the planet, we're one of the most confused about what we should put in our mouth, which I think is hilarious because we're also, completely unique in as far as brain function and everything else. But I also think we overcomplicate it like everything else. It's like we really don't, like I'm not saying everybody should eat ultra simple, but what I am saying is that there's a different diet that is appropriate for everybody. I don't know exactly why, I don't know exactly how, but I think that if we can just find what works for us and then do that, and everybody can do that, and everyone can share their experience, then people can learn and iterate for themselves instead of it feeling. I mean, there are so many people who feel they need to eat a certain way in order to experience something else. There's these conditional things that we put on ourselves, and they're eating more from a place of guilt or fear of shame or anything else instead of actually eating because
Yeah.
that's the way they believe that they were built to eat or they feel great doing it, right? I experienced this with, I was a raw foodist for a while, I was a macrobiotics for a while. I went through a number of different, I guess you could say like strict diet phases. But the thing that I really learned from those is that like those people, just like entrepreneurs do, over identify with that style of eating and it becomes almost like a cult, right? Becomes like we eat this way and anybody else who eats something other than we do is bad. And that's not useful. Not only is it not useful, it's harmful. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to the outcome. It comes down to the goal. It comes down to all this stuff of like, is what I'm doing supporting me, right? So if the way that somebody eats is supporting them and they feel good, check, it's working. Don't focus on it. Like it's not useful to like try and
Yeah.
tweak the metrics, do this and do that, unless you're looking to increase your performance, right? I'm not like super crazy about how I track everything, but it's like if I'm doing something and it's not working, I'm going to take it out like coffee, right? Like caffeine. I am not against caffeine. I absolutely love coffee. I love to make like crazy fun elixirs in the morning, like all kinds of cool beverages. But I also realized at a point a few weeks ago, I was like, I got to stop caffeine. And it was almost like a breakup, right? It was like I really didn't want to do it, but I realized like this is not working right now. It is overstressing my system and my, I guess you could say from baseline to stress was very short, right? So if something in my life happened, I would have a very short fuse and it was
Mm.
100% related to how much caffeine I had that day. So since I've taken it out, it's only been a week and I feel like a freaking monk. Like I just feel like I have infinite patience and that's cool. It's not working for me
Yeah.
right now. Take it out. And I think that the more we can look at things in that nature, right? Like, is this working? Is it not? And assess, the better.
Yeah, I listened to this one dietitian on NPR, and what he said is that he just doesn't eat anything that has more than 5 ingredients in it.
Yeah,
It was
that's a
really,
great
and
way.
I really, that was like 10 years ago, and I really paid close attention to it. And I do pay really close attention to my diet because, again, I feel like my diet is going to be a direct reflection of my ability to do my job. So, I don't
Mhm.
drink more than one cup of coffee a day. And the reason for that too is I don't feel good drinking more than one cup of coffee a day. I actually get
Right.
too hyped up. You know, I try to incorporate vegetables in all of my meals, and I happen to love vegetables, so it's good. But and then this is the other thing I just want to mention to our listeners that when I get up in the morning, I think my number one priority is what time am I going to exercise today?
Mhm.
That's just the number one priority. And if I have too much going on during the day, I'll go to exercise first thing in the morning because I want to get my exercise in for that day.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a friend the other day, and he's an investment banker on Wall Street, and he played football for Harvard, and he was saying, he goes and exercises because it's a mental thing. It helps him clear his mind, and I think I feel the same way. Like it's something that I have to do, and I consider it more important than like not only more important, but I enjoy it more than my job.
Absolutely. And if you train right too, like if you're very aware, present, mindful, and you're training like with a relative amount of intensity, you can't not pay attention. Like you have to be really present in order
Yeah,
to do it. Because if you're throwing around, like I like unconventional training gear, right? I like kettlebells, I like steel maces, I like a lot of that kind of stuff. And you can't throw around you can't do kettlebell cleans and that kind of stuff and be distracted, right? You just can. It's
yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
impossible. So it's almost like a mini retreat, and you get to really test boundaries. So it's great on so many levels.
So, like, I'll send a challenge out to our listeners. Try these two things. And again, this is an experiment, right? If you're, let's face it, most of the people that are out there, like right now, I'm doing competitive rowing
Hmm.
on lakes, so I took that up. But most people are not doing ultra marathons, they're not doing marathons, they're not doing rowing. They're so try these two things. Um, Exercise every day or every other day for 2 weeks and see how you do at your job at work and see if you're more productive and if your mind's clear. And then also maybe apply that same principle to something that you want to change in your diet. Like, so Jeff, like, what would you say for somebody who's not really, that athletic and doing a lot of different, heavy duty athletic events? What would be a change so that way you can experience if something's working or not with your diet? What would that one or two things be?
Well, first thing could be to eat more whole foods. So, just like any goal, numbers and definition will dictate results. So, it's got to be easy and it's got to be definitive, right? So, if you go, I'm going to eat more vegetables, that's a great way to lose, right? If you say, I'm going to eat one vegetable at each meal, that's great, right? Or if I'm going to eat two vegetables every night at dinner for 2 weeks, something clear, something decisive like that, but just incorporating more vegetables is great. Another thing that's great too, Stephen, is decreasing volume, right? So if like people are used to eating like 2 plates of food, eat a plate and a half or one plate, right? Most people think they need to add a whole bunch of stuff in or like do things a whole lot different. Most people are overeating. And the energy it takes to digest a gigantic meal, especially if you're not training and you're not using those calories, there's an exorbitant amount of energy expended to digest a lot of food, especially heavy meals. And then people reach for caffeine and then they, need a drink at night to cool off and wind down. So it sets up a lot. So either eating a little bit less or adding in vegetables. Those are two great things to start.
What do you do when you have that you're eating because it's an emotional thing? So you're stressed out at work, um, and you just overeat because it makes you feel good. What do you do about that situation?
That's actually a great question. And that is something that I've personally dealt with on many occasions and still do from time to time. So the way that I personally do it, and David Hawkins, he wrote Power versus Force. He wrote Letting Go. Those are two of my favorites of his. He's wrote a ton of books, but those are two of them. And in Letting Go, he talks about consciously using coping mechanisms, right? So he talks about it in this context of like, if you're under a lot of stress in a lot of different areas, consciously use a coping mechanism, right? If you tend to like sit down and watch two movies, do that, but do it consciously. If you're going to, in this case, like consume a shitload of food and just like almost just overeat on purpose because you're trying to numb yourself because you're stressed, do it. But then instead of just doing it and feeling guilty at the end, do it and then examine why you did it. So you're using that kind of quote unquote coping mechanism or that strategy, but then you're reflecting on why you did it in the first place. So it starts to rewire, right?
Mm.
Hebb's principle, I think it's called, is nerves that fire together, wire together, neuroscience principle. So if it's originally wired as eat a lot of food, feel guilty, eat a lot of food, feel guilty, that circuitry in the brain is wired. So every time you eat a lot of food, you feel guilty. If you start to rewire that, right? This is a simple neuroplasticity kind of technique or like a rewiring pattern is eat and reflect, eat and reflect, eat and reflect. You will be able to start to switch those two out. So then in the future, you'll be able to reflect before you do all that eating.
I'm afraid to bring this up to you, Jeff, because I don't know what your response is going to be. But so, by the way, that book that David Hauser had written called Unstoppable, and that's where again we talked about experimenting. So I had been reading a
Hmm.
lot about intermittent fasting, and I didn't really wasn't a big fan of it, the concept. And so I said, you know what?
Hmm.
Let me experiment with it and see what happens. And so what I did was, every once in a while, I wouldn't eat breakfast and lunch. And I thought the result was going to be that I would eat so much more at the end of the day. And the result for me, I've tried this for about 5 months now. The result for me was that I didn't eat more at the end of the day, and I actually was less hungry, and and I became much more aware of, I don't know, I just didn't have those hunger pains that I'd had. And then when the days
Hmm.
I didn't do the intermittent fasting, I ate less. So it worked. It seems to work for me. But are you a fan of that intermittent fasting idea?
I personally like it. I'm not a doctor. I
Mhm.
don't give health advice like that. But as far as fasting goes, I interviewed a guy on my podcast, Dr. Frank Merritt. He wrote the 17-hour fast. And he talks about
Mhm.
using this strategy for a ton of different maladies. And he even has a lot of different practices around it, like eliminating technology and or making it a point to connect to people at night instead of being on your devices and all kinds of great stuff. But so that's a great way to look at it as well. But for me personally, I've always been into fasting, right? Like I've done a water fast in the desert for 7 days. I've fasted for 20 something days just on the lemonade diet, right? Maple syrup, cayenne, and lemon juice. So it's like, I personally believe that fasting is a fantastic way to do a lot of things, right? To like give your digestive system a break, to reach higher states of consciousness, right? To have new ideas, to it's the list goes on and on and on and on and on, and it's been like that. I mean, fasting is not a new technology, and I personally think intermittent fasting is great. But I think a lot of people, like everything else, they follow it like a religion, meaning that if they mess up or if they sin, that they're going to be punished by some god or something, which I think is a great way to fail. So it's like if people are using intermittent fasting as a way to achieve some kind of health goal or like lose some weight or feel great, that's awesome. But I think a lot of people make it this thing they have to do forever. And then what ends up happening is on holidays, they eat like a ton of stuff and end up overeating and then go back on it. So, like anything, used wisely is great.
I was afraid when I asked you that question what you were going to say. I was like holding my breath. I was like, oh, I wonder what he's going to say about intermittent fasting. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you
Yeah.
kind
If it
of,
works, man,
you know,
all the power to you,
yeah.
man.
Yeah. But again, I think it goes back to the idea of, trying something that's different and seeing if it works
Yeah.
for you. You know, I kind of want to share with my listeners, not that it's a little out of the ordinary. I don't like exactly talking about myself because it's the guest. Um, but what it's like for me is I shared with everybody here that I prioritize my health first over my business, and that is I make sure I exercise. So that's number one. Number two is I look at every meal that I eat as important for my business, and that is if I eat the right way, I tend to do better. I feel better. I have more energy. I do more focused at work. Um, the third thing, which I hadn't mentioned, it was about 3 years I took up meditation, and so a couple times a week I will at the office or at home take 10-15 minutes and meditate. And I'm not going to get into the different types of meditation, but what I find is it slows me down. So when I tend to be a multitasker, like you can't believe. And so what it allows me to do is to stop that, to allow me to think more strategically instead of being a multitasker who can accomplish anything in the world. and that's been extremely beneficial for me. I'm 55 years old, and so what I found is the older I get, the the more I have to pay attention to my health to be able to produce the same amount or better results. Um, and then the other thing is like I pick up things that are fun. Like so, I took up competitive rowing this year on a lake, and I was a competitive, very competitive ranked tennis player, and so you know, the one thing I try to do is make exercise fun. I still go to the gym, but I usually am training because of the sport that I'm involved with. And and again, I mentioned to you, I only limit myself to 1 cup of coffee a day. And now that I'm getting older, I've really cut back on the amount of alcohol I'm drinking, and it just makes a big difference. And so I did want to share with everybody. I mean, Jeff, do you have any recommendations? What else I should be doing?
um, yeah, I mean, I've got a list. Depends on your goals, but I mean,
Yeah,
whatever you're multitasking, I think is one of those things that a lot of entrepreneurs think is effective, but it's very ineffective for the most part. There's always exceptions, but I've got a couple of great strategies that I use with my clients as far as like how to multitask on purpose, right? So instead of being that kind of like first responder mentality, right? Like always bouncing around, like dealing,
yep,
putting out fires, basically, small ones or big ones, how to really block that out and do that effectively at certain parts of the day so that you're the one that's down regulating or controlling your system, not other people. Um, but I mean, I think meditation's a great tool. I mean, I personally do an hour a day, but that's just my own practice that's been cultivated over I don't even know how many years, forever and a day.
yeah, it's good advice. I'll take your advice and definitely work on that multitasking, thing. So, I'd like to thank Jeff today for really coming on our podcast. If you like today's podcast, please feel free to share it with a friend and also subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. And of course, if you're looking for a line of credit for